everyone. Thank you for making it this late.
Hello, everyone.
I'm Alessandro Canossa. This is Sasha.
Hello,
and
guys.
we work at Ubisoft, specifically in Malmo. There's a studio called Massive. We make computer games. Ubisoft has invested considerably in the last years in data science and in data intelligence to understand our players. I don't know how many of you are computer game players. Can I have just an idea? One, five. Okay.
Yeah, we do have a bit.
Okay. So some of you are aware that there has been a shift in the game industry, meaning that games tend to be always connected, always live, always requiring interaction between two people. And Ubisoft has been pioneering this type of live games. And this kind of led automatically to the growth of an internal capacity for data science and intelligence. These live games, as I mentioned, they require constant connection because they have a lot of interaction between players, but at the same time, they also allow for tracking a large amount of data that are used to create behavioral profiles, to help with matchmaking, to help with recommendation, and in general, to help with improving the player experience and the products we're making. We are here today, maybe comes as a surprise, not to talk about machine learning. Today, here, we are focusing on social network analysis and how we can leverage measures from social network analysis to create value and make a difference in the industry.
And before we jump into the details of what we did, let us give you some context of the product we work with, because data is coming from it anyway. So the product is Tom Clancy's The Division, an open-world, online, multiplayer video game released by Massive Entertainment from Malmo 2.5 years ago. At the moment of the release, the game was the most successful new IP in the video games industry. And live to date, we have more than 20 million players. The plot of the game revolves around a strange epidemic of a virus which unleashed on the city of New York and has plunged the city into chaos. You play as an agent of Division, a secret governmental network of undercover agents who are trained for this purpose, basically to solve problems when all the law enforcement agencies collapse. You can do all sorts of things in the game. You can explore the open world, you can go through the main plot, figure out what happened with the entire virus thing, or you can compete with different players in different game modes. You can either play alone, or you can team up with random players or your friends. And we also put in a small video in the presentation for you guys to get a good grip of the mood of the game. So let's see it.
I trained for a scenario like this my entire life. But it's worse than anything we could have imagined. We don't have much intel, and we don't have the luxury of failure. Not with Manhattan under lockdown and Brooklyn on the brink. People like me and you, we're what's left to hold the line.
Every criminal group that we've been dealing with is controlling most of these neighborhoods. Taking whatever they want, killing whoever they want, because we got nobody to stop them. Burn them! I mean, an area this size, this many bad guys, I just don't like the idea of throwing you to the wolves.
Captain, we are the wolves. These are my
This is my city. We're taking it back.
Okay, it's very important that we understand a key feature of this type of live game. Players can, so the game has turned New York into a gigantic playground, and players can take any of the available activities, which mostly revolve around shooting people in the face, alone or in groups. Groups are created either with random people or through a list of your friends that are already validated. This is a key piece of information because what we wanted to examine was the phenomenon of social contagion. Do behaviors spread between micro-communities? Do people start looking like each other the more they hang out together? And what are the positive behaviors that we want to scaffold? And how can we measure this impact? So the whole research has been designed around these topics. In social science, there is a known phenomenon called social contagion that sees ourselves doing what our community does. And mostly there are people that are more influential than others that tend to perspire behavior and infect people with other behaviors. I keep using this contagion and infection because of the theme of the game, but it's actually the technical terms for it. So we want to see two things mostly. Do influencers exist in video game, and do they impact their community as much as they are known to do in other non-digital environments?
Like social media.
Exactly. The first step was to identify this influencer using different measures, and then to measure their impact.
Yep. So to define the social contagion, we basically want to look at the metrics that describe the interaction between players. Specifically, we want to see who plays with whom, for how long they play, how often, and then we basically try to understand the direction of this interaction. Specifically, we hypothesize that influencers are people who are passionate about the game, who are very vocal in the community, who have a wide network of friends or connections in the game, and they are very actively engaged with the multiplayer aspects of the game.
We isolated two data sets. We isolated a sample of 246,000 players. Within this sample, we wanted to find two populations. The influencer, people that respond to some characteristics that we define as influencer, and then the power users, which is the top users, people with the highest performance level, with the highest number of hours in the game, and with the highest score, the highest rated gear. So these are the two populations that we want to compare across. And in order to identify power users, it was very simple, like a set of filters. While for the influencers, we wanted to use social networks metrics of centrality and prestige. We'll be going a bit more in detail. But the raw data, basically, it's who creates most groups, who invites other people mostly, are the people invited quick matches or friends, and do quick matches turn into friends afterwards. The 6 measures that we used for identifying the influencers are in degree, out degree, page rank, betweenness, closeness, and eigenvector. There is not a lot of agreement in social network analysis on which is the measure that best identifies influencers. They're all more or less overlapping. There was an attempt to do a correlation between the 6 measures, and they're all kind of strongly correlated, but not enough to be redundant. So they all try more or less explain similar behaviors, but they're different enough for us to actually want to consider all of them. So we measure the 6 metrics for centrality and prestige for all the players, and then we intersected the top scoring players for each one of these measures to identify what we call the influencers.
Yeah, and so after we've done all of this analysis, we plotted all of it on the network supergraph. And on it, what you can see is that every node is a player, is a real person behind it. The color indicates the community. So whatever color it is, the player belongs to that community. determined by it, and the size reflects the social importance of the player. And what we define as social importance is the social activity, meaning that it encompasses all of the activities that you have defined, so things like friends, creation of groups, and just interaction with other players in the game.
Wait a second. So there's the 49 influencers we identified. They are more or less plotted all in the center of this firework. It's indicative because, as you can see, there are communities that are floating completely, some other communities that are a bit peripheral but still kind of connected, and then there's deeply entangled communities. All the influencers we found are, except one or two, found in the entangled center of the supergraph.
And also we have to say that all the influencers we have, they basically, the communities they belong to, they cover basically the entire population of the players we looked into. And now we will go into the results of the analysis. So let's start from some stats.
Okay, so a little bit of a description of the communities here. We have playtime is the amount of time that people spend playing. Number of friends is the amount of friends that they have in their profile. And the extent of the reach is how many people they interacted with, inviting to groups or being invited to groups. So the influencers have less hours than power users, meaning that averagely they spend around 119 hours, while power users are more on the 450 size. In number of friends, influencers have a much higher number than power users, much higher. And also the extent of the reach is incredible. Basically, influencers play with 340 people, averagely. To give you a quick idea, the 49 influencers we identified reach a network of 16,000 people. And many of these people become from quick matches into friends, while the same behavior cannot be seen in the other group. But,
yeah, and also I think what's worth pointing out is that if you look into the networks of power users and influencers, you can see that the power users usually have 27 friends, and extent of reach is also 27, which means that they basically play only with their friends, so people they know, while the influencers, they have, in our case, 208 friends, but they play with way more people, so they are way more active with just people they don't know in the game. And so, as Alessandro said already, we identified 49 influencers, and to compare the impact on the community, we also took 49 power users, and then we identified the period of time we want to look at, and then we took data on all the players who interacted both with the 49 influencers and the 49 power users, and we looked into the period of time before the interaction, 2 weeks before, and after the interaction. And the metrics we looked at were the daily average play time and social play ratio. And when we say social play ratio, this is basically just the fraction of time in the game you spend playing with other people versus playing alone. While daily average play time is exactly what it is, just the average number of hours you spend in the game, on average. And so the hypothesis we were testing out, the H0, would be that we would say that if the influencers don't have any behavioral impact on the community, then we would not see any change in the behavior of players before and after the interactions. It would be completely the same. And we were comparing that to the power users to see what happened. And conversely, the H1 would be that we will observe such a change, and we will see that the players, after the interaction, have changed their behavior, meaning that influencers actually can impact the population of players in the game. And so, as you have seen on the previous graph, basically what we have identified with statistical significance is that meeting an influencer in the game is a pivotal moment for a player's journey in the virtual world. Basically, what we've seen is that, on average, players start spending about 30 minutes more in the game on a daily basis, and also they start spending more time in groups, meaning that on average we had about 41% of their playtime being spent in groups, and it goes up to 59%. And we did not observe any such changes for power users. And since we did all the t-tests and the p-values, then we could say that actually, yes, the influencers do change the behavior, and we could say that our hypothesis was right. And as they say, H1 must fly, right? Something like that.
Okay, so in a way, it's a little bit misleading for us to call influencers these players, because influencer usually is somebody on YouTube or on Twitch that influences people from a position of authority, more or less. While these players that we have identified, they are very often not even aware of the role that they have in the community. It's not a conscious effort that they make. They're not particularly visible in terms of media exposure, but they keep the community alive. We started this type of work because in a live game, like Ubisoft is investing in doing, long-term retention is what drives the value. It's not about selling the game, people played for, 20, 30 hours and then it's over, but it's actually creating an experience that can continue over time. This is the 2.5 years since release, and we still have a very lively community because the game is designed to afford for a long tail of retention and engagement. These influencers are the core of it. They are contributing actively at creating a good experience for other players and to create the dynamic movement for the multiplayer part. This is important for us to understand the dynamics of how influences are created, what are the measures that create them, and beside the fact that they create a lot of groups, does this have an impact? Apparently, yes. We have seen that the retention, which is how many people are still playing after 1 year, for the power user community is 29%, but the power users are a very committed, by definition, community. We kind of identified them using playtime, and their playtime is known to be very high. So it's a tautology to say that retention for power users is high. While influencers were not identified using the amount of time they spend in the game, and yet they still have a retention over a year of 23%, which is very high. If you compare other live games like Destiny or things like that, in the 1 year tail, the retention is quite much lower than that.
And also, we wanted to see the migration between categories, specifically saying, of all those 16,000 people who interacted with our 49 influencers back when we did the analysis, how many of those players became influencers themselves, meaning how many of them converted to being influencers. And we compared that number to the number of people who interacted with power users and became influencers themselves. And the difference was rather drastic, actually, because of those 16,000 people, a bit more than 60,000, 26% became influencers themselves in a year, while if you take the same number for the power users community, it was only 6%. So you can clearly see that if you hold everything constant, basically the influencers do impact the behavior quite a bit.
This is the contagion, the spreading of behavior we are talking about. At the same time, we started wondering, are influencers a special type of player, or anyone can become an influencer? Basically, we wanted to start probing into the motivation, psychological motivation for people to behave like this. At Ubisoft, we have developed a survey called the UPEC, Ubisoft Perceived Experience Questionnaire, that probes player motivation. The survey was based on self-determination theory in psychology. It's been iterated over 8 years. 50,000 respondents have taken it, and is being used and in use for 8 of the games that Ubisoft has made in the recent years. Just to give you a very quick summary of what is self-determination theory and how we look at motivation. Self-determination theory is based on 3 pillars. It's a collection of 3 mini theories. The theory about autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy means how self-driven you are, and the two facets for autonomy is agency and playstyle. Competence is about how masterful you are, and again is growth and mastery. While for relatedness, it's about how important it is for you to relate with other entities, other agents. So friendship, interdependence, and NPC relatedness. We added a fourth pillar in terms of presence or immersion that basically looks at how much you are likely to be transported somewhere. Now, this long preamble about motivation is because we asked, I think it was 7,000 players, 7,000 players to take the motivation test. Out of these 7,000 players, there were influencers in them. And basically comparing the mean scores for the population of power users and influencers, we noticed some really interesting differences in the highlighted spots. And this basically is starting us to think that it's possible to predict motivations for people that never took the test. Basically, it's some of the future work that maybe we'll talk about later.
Yeah, it was 7,342 people, and we could basically say what were their motivations, and then we could actually assume, because it's still to be tested out, that maybe if we look at the in-game behavior, we might actually be able to predict their motivations without them taking the survey. Yeah. And so, jump into the conclusions. What we can say is that in case of Tom Clancy's The Division, the influencers are the invisible backbone of the in-game community, and we assume they might have a similar impact in other games as well. And they can change the behavior of the audiences because they have a wide reach, and they are very passionate and active about the actual product. And overall, we call them the social butterflies. Because of their passion and engagement, they can shape the communities by their presence.
So, very simply, the summary is that some influencers are different than power users, and they cannot be identified with simple queries. Social network analysis was necessary to identify their centrality and their prestige in the immediate and larger communities. They touch a larger audience, as we've seen, and they have an immediate impact on the behavior of people that start playing with them. And lastly, what can we use this for? There's like a number of projects that we are starting around this topic, but very concretely, as I mentioned before, we can actually start predicting motivation of different players based on their logged play behavior. So if we administer a survey to a small sample, like a few thousand, it's enough to actually being able to infer the same responses from other players. And we can also start doing prediction in terms of what behaviors lead to actually becoming one of the influencers. Yeah, this is the kind of the future steps that we started working on.
And I think it's also worth saying that probably in any product where you have users interacting with one another, you could probably pinpoint this kind of audience, which might probably be changing or shaping up how your entire customer base behaves. So we hope it's useful not only for video games people, but basically for everyone. And overall, thank you very much, guys. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, either ask now or you have our emails. Any questions?